perhaps have the time we'd like to do the reviews as we like to do them. But anybody remember what happened in Genesis 25, what the dominant theme is in Genesis 25? The death of Abraham. That's exactly right. And so it doesn't surprise us then in chapter 26 we find what? God making the covenant with Isaac and repeating that covenant. Then in chapter 27, he takes the blessing, And then in 28, he's next thing you know, he's out of town, isn't it? He's leaving, heading back to Haran, partly to escape his brother's wrath, partly to do what? Find a wife, not in Canaan. 29, we find the story of Rachel and Leah. And then we are in chapter 30, looking at Jacob's family. Appreciate Donald stepping in and taking the class this past week. Very much appreciate that work. I think we were down to chapter 30 and about verse 25. When by this point in time we have the 11 of the sons that had been born. Jacob says to Laban, I need to leave. My family has grown, but I'm not building my wealth. I'm building your wealth. And so Laban says, well, all right. I wish you wouldn't go. Because the King James says in Genesis 30 and verse 27, I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. Anybody have another word for experience there? Divine. Say it again.
Divine.
How does it read there?
I have divine. The Lord has blessed me on your account.
Yeah. It is that word for divine that's used there. The Hebrew word means to hiss, to whisper, a magic spell, divination. And the question comes up, did he mean that literally? Was he using divination? We know he had other gods. It's hard to know how far this fellow had gone. Maybe, I like to think most charitably, maybe it's just a way of expressing the fact that he is discerned. Not through the occult, but we might just say, I've been reading the tea leaves here and I can see that this is going to be a problem. Maybe that was the case. Sometimes it's used that way in the Scriptures. But anyway, what Laban says is, I figured out that God blesses you. And it's good to be standing near you when God blesses you. So, wish you'd stay. Appoint me your wages. What will it take? And what they agree on is, Jacob says in verse 32, I will pass through all thy flock today, and I will remove from the flock for me the odd color. He calls them in the Old King James the speckled and spotted, among the cattle, among the sheep, among the goats. I don't know exactly what that entailed, but the odd color. If sheep are normally white, the ones that are not white but have this coloring, they'll be mine. Those who know more than I do would say that might be no more usually than 20%. These odd colors would be, by definition, more rare. So I'll take the least common among the animals in coloring. And those will be mine. And so Laban agrees to this. But look at verse 35. Be it according to your word, and then he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-streaked and spotted, and the she-goats. And so what did Jacob suggest? I'll go through there and I'll separate these out. But it seems that Laban said, I'll do it. And so he does. And he also, verse 36, set 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. That was his idea. So he doesn't want any intermixing here. He wants to set this up to where it's the most advantageous for him. Jacob had said, if you see any animal that's not colored right among you, you can count it stolen. I'll be responsible for that crime. But now this is the arrangement, and so it is. Now verse 37 talks about how that Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of hazel and chestnut, and he peeled white streaks in them and made white appear which was in the rod. And he set the rods which he had peeled before the flocks in the gutters and the watering troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. So when the animals would come together and they would conceive, they would be here in the presence of looking at these now striped sticks. He seems to make a connection between that and the kind of animal that they would produce. And also, verse 40 says, something else that he did separate the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the Reem Street, and all the brown in the flock. So he has these animals, when they are conceiving, they are facing the animals that look like Jacob wanted to look. And the question becomes, it's very peculiar, why would he do that? A couple of answers have been suggested. One of them is, first of all, obviously, there's no genetic connection here. This is not science. That's not the way it works. So there were those maybe who thought that's the way it did work. Superstition and so on. And so perhaps it was Jacob falling into superstition, trying to help along the process here. Maybe. That's so. I hope not. There's another possibility. Maybe, and it's not spoken here, this is conjecture. Maybe the Lord told him to do this. The Lord told him to do this as a condition of granting him prosperity. Again, there's nothing in the text about that. But perhaps this is not an act of regression, an act of superstition on Jacob's part. Because I like to think that this man's grown since his early days. But I think perhaps it might be, possibly, a response to the obedience to God's condition. God said, I want you to do this so that you may know that this is my work. He did know that, didn't he? If you look over in 31, we'll get to that in just a second, in verse 9, he tells his wives, he says, God has taken away the cattle of your father, given it to me. He didn't think it was the sticks or where they were looking at the time of conception that made the difference. He said, this is the work of God. And surely it was. Verse 41 says that when the stronger conceived, he did these things. And the result was that he increased greatly. Verse 43, the last verse there, chapter 30, and the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle and maidservants and men servants and camels and asses. As a result of the growing flock, his wealth grew in general. Now, that caused some problems with Laban. In chapter 31, we're going to read about Jacob fleeing from Laban. And in chapter 31 in verse 1, and he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and that which was gotten of our father hath he, and that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. He's made himself rich at the expense of our fathers, as if he had robbed Laban in some way. But he heard those rumblings. And certainly, it says in verse 2 of chapter 31, that Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban. It was not the same as it had been. He didn't look at him the same way. We know what that means. People, this passive-aggressive look, that we're all familiar with as human beings. Jacob felt that hostility from Laban. And then a third thing that he mentions here. The Lord, verse 3, said to Jacob, return unto the land of thy fathers and of thy kindred, and I will be with thee. And so, with all those things having taken place, Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah. And he met with them out in the field unto his flock. And he said, your father's countenance is not what it was toward me. And he said, your father has never dealt right with me. Verse 6, let's begin there. You know that with all my power I have served your father, and your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God will not suffer him to hurt me. We'll see a little bit later, I think, maybe what he means by that changing 10 times, his wages. But in verse 9, thus God has taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me. No matter what Laban said, whether he said, well, no, you can't take all the odd color, just the ring streak. They'd all come out ring streak. You can't take all the odd color, just the speckled. Well, then they'd all start being born speckled. So God, he could see the providence of God in all of this, his work. So, verse 11, another thing that he mentions is, the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob, I said, here am I. He said, lift up now thine eyes and see. All the rams which leap upon the cattle are ring-streaked and speckled and grizzled. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowest a vow unto me. Now arise, and get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. Thou vowest a vow unto me. Donald took you through the story at Bethel back in chapter 28. That'd been 20 years ago, hadn't it? But God remembered the vow. 20 years ago, God remembered the vow. God remembers. You know, time passes, men forget, God does not forget. Well, after all this, Rachel and Leah answer to Jacob, and they say, no problem with us to leave. Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted of him strangers? Hath he not sold us? Hath he not quite devoured our money? For all the riches which God has taken from our father is ours, our children's. Now then, whatsoever God hath said, do it. Do it because God said it, but also do it because this isn't home anymore. We've been sold. Somebody, I think it was Derek Kinder, one of those fellows writing about Genesis that I read, made a great point. He said, this is an example of the unseen price of covetousness. I thought, that's a great point. You know, Laban had been good at snatching and grabbing and getting and stuff in his pockets. But I'll tell you what, whatever he got, would it be worth it if your daughters felt this way about you? Nothing to be worth that. So Rachel and Leah say, no problem with us. Better for us, better for our children. That's our family. So Jacob arose, verse 17, his wives and his sons. And he carried away all of his goods and his cattle. And he's heading back toward Canaan. Now verse 19 says he took something that wasn't his. He didn't know it. But Laban went to shear sheep while Jacob makes his escape, I guess we could say. And Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's, the household gods, the teraphim. Again, showing that these things were present in the house of Laban. You know, Joshua had said these people were idolaters. Now, he certainly knows and has respect for the God of Abraham, but you have to wonder sometimes if that was the only God that he knew. It seems likely not. So, Jacob, verse 20, struck out away from Laban before he knew it. He fled. He went across the river, which seems to be the Euphrates, and set his face heading toward Mount Gilead. It was 3 days before Laban found out that he had left. So what does he do? Verse 23, Laban takes his brethren and he pursues after him. You have to wonder, why was he pursuing? Was he pursuing just to say goodbye? Was he looking for his stuff? Maybe both those, maybe more. Did he plan to just force him to return? It's hard to know what all was in his mind. But 7 days it took him. And finally he did overtake him in Mount Gilead. Now in the meantime, verse 34 says that God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night. And this is what he told him. Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Verse 24. Do you have another translation of that, good or bad? They got the same thing, good or bad? What do you think it means, good or bad? What might be good? What good thing could he say to him? I've been thinking about this, and if you'll just come back, we'll go 50-50 on this thing. What do you say? That's the best deal I can make you. Try to bribe him to stay? That would be a positive thing. What might be the bad? Yes, sir.
Laban seems to feel like he owns him. His daughters, even later on, his children. It's like he feels like he's running the show here, and how dare Jacob, and he decides to part things like, hey, I'd be well within my life. Just get rid of you.
But he does say that, doesn't he? But he might do it, that's the idea. He could threaten him, he could hurt him, harm him in some way, rob him. But God said, don't you dare. I don't want you trying to bribe him to stay, and I don't want you to try to threaten him to stay. It's my will that he go. Well, Laban did overtake him in verse 25, beginning there. And Laban said, what have you done? What have you done that you've stolen away, snuck out, as it were, in the middle of the night, secretly? I would have sent you away with songs and with the tabret and the harp. You've not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters. You've done very foolishly. Well, we'll see about that. It's in my power to do you hurt. But the God of your father, I don't know, am I reading too much into that? The God of your father. The God of your father spake to me yesternight. Balaam, later on, as we read about Balaam, was a fellow who knew God, but he wasn't exactly faithful, was he? Maybe God used him. I think he did use him on that occasion. But you don't have to be devoted to know the God of Abraham in the sense we're talking about here. But your God spoke to me the other day and said I was not to speak to you good or bad. And now, if this is not all bad enough, you've stolen my gods. And then Jacob answers in verse 31, and he said, I'll tell you why I left, because I was afraid of you. I was afraid of what you'd do. I was afraid that you would take by force my children from me. And as far as the other's concerned, if you find your God among the stuff of any of my people, then let them die. He didn't know Rachel had taken it. He was innocent of the matter. Now, you'd think, well, that ought to be enough. Listen, we're brethren, and you say you didn't take it? Okay, I believe you. He proceeds to go into his tent, rummage through his stuff, and then his wives' tents. This was highly insulting. Did you take my... I didn't take it. Well, empty your pockets. Let me see. How would you feel if somebody did you that way? Well, when he got to Rachel's tent, you remember that she made an excuse. She was sitting on this idol. Why did Rachel take it? That's another question he does not answer. I don't think she revered these gods because she was sitting on them. If she was menstruating, that certainly would have been defiling. Maybe this was an excuse. I don't know all of that. But the bottom line is, I don't think she had any reverence for them necessarily. Maybe she was doing it just to spite her father. Maybe she thought, well, he's sold me, I'm going to sell something to him. I don't know. But be that as it may, she gets away with it, at least at this point. We'll see what happens to those idols shortly. But so it is that he doesn't find anything. And now Jacob has his say. Beginning in verse 36. Now you tell me, what is my trespass that you would chase after me like I'm a criminal? Where is my crime? You've looked through all my stuff. You've embarrassed me, humiliated me, accused me in front of all these people. Tell you what you do. You just put out here in front of all of us what you found. Nothing. That's what you found. 20 years I've been with you. I've taken care of your flocks. That's been my job. I've not eaten one of them. If they were lost, taken by the wolf or whatever it might be, I paid the price for it. That's what a good shepherd does, by the way. And I had a lot of sleepless nights watching over your things faithfully. And what you've done to me, you've changed my wages 10 times. And except, verse 42, the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac, that is, the God that Isaac feared, unless he had been with me, you'd have left me now empty-handed, and you know it. That, I think, was his original motive in bringing all those people to chase after him. And then Laban in verse 43 answers. I like to think he answered maybe in a soft voice, having been told off, and rightly so. But he says this. He says, these daughters are my daughters, and these children my children. These cattle are my cattle. All that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters and unto their children which were born? Some read that and they think he's grabbing again. He's trying to assert his ownership. But I don't think that fits here. Maybe that's the way he felt originally. But I think after all that's happened, I like to put it in the light of, you think I could hurt you. This is my flesh and blood. And I can't hurt you. I'm not here to hurt you. And what follows fits that vein, I think, when he says, let us make a covenant. Here's a non-aggression pact that will be made. We've seen that before, haven't we? Abraham and the Philistines and Isaac and the Philistines made these agreements that we'll do each other well and not harm each other. We won't be enemies. And there's a monument that's built. They gather up stones and they call it Gilead. Laban uses a word that means the same thing in the Aramaic language, but in the Hebrew it's Gilead, Gilead, we say, literally meaning a heap of witness. This is the monument to witness this agreement between us two. This is how Laban put it, verse 48. This heap is a witness between me and thee this day. And Mizpah. They called it Mizpah as well. Do you have a footnote of what Mizpah means? Watchtower? Yeah, exactly. Look out. For, he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent from one another. I think that's been romanticized. But really what I think it is he's saying that even when we can't see each other, the Lord watch each of us to make sure we don't mistreat. Well, in particular, that Jacob doesn't mistreat the family that Laban is saying goodbye to. Verse 50, I think explains, if thou shalt afflict my daughters, take other wives, no man is between us, but the Lord is witness between us. So I've seen Mizpah on jewelry, two sweethearts, will have the Mizpah, the Lord watch between me and thee while we're away. I think the meaning may be a little darker than that. He's saying, God judge you, even if I don't see you, if you do something wrong. That's the real, I think, context of Mizpah in this passage. Again, he says, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us. Are those two different gods or the same God? But Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac, the God that Isaac feared. And sacrifices were offered there on the mount. And they ate bread, they tarried there all night. And then verse 55, early in the morning, Laban rose up and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned to his place. And that chapter is closed. But what Jacob knows is that, well, I got past that great threat. But I'm heading back to the land near where my brother lives, and I got to deal with that as well. He had left 20 years before, and what terms had he left with Esau 20 years before? When my father dies, they thought that the father was going to die. I think Isaac thought he was going to die pretty soon. Actually, he didn't. He lived for many more years. But Esau said, I can't wait to put that fellow in the ground. Now, 20 years have passed, but people can hold a grudge. And I'm not so sure that he wasn't right about that grudge, by the way, as you read the next chapter. Any particular point about 31 before we try to hit 32? Yes, sir.
One thing I thought about, where you mentioned earlier about where you said Laban changed wages 10 times. I thought about when it started out, the agreement was, I'll get the spotted animals in the ground. And then we noticed that he did the sticks and the trawl. And the stripe of God was with him. Do you think that was, he did this 10 times? It doesn't mention it 10 times, but maybe that might be the meaning of that he just kept changing it.
I think Jacob was the one who was doing that. He was the one trying to work with that, right? And so I don't think that was Laban changed 10 times. Yes, sir, in the sense that it seems at first he said, all the odd colors are yours. But then he'd say, well, no, not all of them, just the ring streaked. And then here they'd all be ring streaked. Well, no, not that, all the speckled. So they'd all be speckled. So I think Laban, first of all, said, yes, you can take all the odd colors. That's the way I read it. But then he got more specific. No, not all of them, just these.
Because he saw God was blessing.
Absolutely.
And he said, oh, I don't mind a mistake here.
Exactly.
We need to renegotiate this kind of thing.
Right. Well, it wasn't so much a renegotiation, it was just an imposition. Yeah, I'm going to take it, yeah. Yes, sir.
The number you come up with, it mentioned,
Right.
change my wages 10 times. I don't know if that's a
Yeah, I don't either. That's a good point. It could be just simply saying, I've told you this 100 times. Well, not 99 plus 1 necessarily, but over and over again, you've done this to me. Yes, that's right. Laban didn't treat him right. What I love about it is, and again, if we're right about this, if Jacob wasn't falling back into superstition, but maybe out of obedience to God, that's speculation. I can't prove that. But I like to think that in this story, thinking back on Jacob as a younger fellow, when he was taking the blessing away from Esau, he resorted, on his mother's advice, to trickery and deceit. It seems like here he knows where the blessing's coming from, and he trusts God in that regard. And that would be, if it's obedience, it's an act, I think, of faith. So anyway, but yes, sir, I think this is, I hope we can see here maybe a fellow who's changed a bit through the years. Yes, sir.
Do you find it interesting that you said like Laban had those idols, that, there was evidences of God's power, and even Laban had to admit that, and yet these people were so superstitious, they just mixed God in with the, you find that, it's crazy.
Yeah, it sounds like America, doesn't it? Yeah, it's very common, isn't it now? The New Age movement and all that kind of nonsense, or Christian yoga practitioners. I don't know what that means even. Yes, sir. It's common demand, isn't it? So I didn't show you that wonderful chart there. Chapter 32. We're going to have to figure out what we're going to do about Esau and what Esau's going to do with us. And it's a great chapter. The first couple of verses are interesting. Jacob makes his way. Now with Laban in the rearview mirror, looking ahead to the challenges to come. And verse 2 says, when Jacob saw them, verse 1 says, he saw the angels of God that met him. And when he saw them, if they had a message, it's not recorded. It seems their presence was a message. And this is what he gathered from their presence. He said, this is God's host. And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. 2 hosts, 2 camps. We'll read about Mahanaim again, won't we? In the days of after Saul and King David. But we'll come back to it. But here, this place originally gets its name because God's host appeared to Jacob. And he said, I'm not alone. There are 2 hosts here. My host and God's host. I think the message was there to give him reassurance that God saw, just as he did with Laban. So he would in what was to come. What Jacob decides to do, beginning in verse 3, is to send messengers to find Esau and to tell him this. Thus shall you speak, verse 4, to my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob has said thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and I have stayed here until now. And I have oxen and asses and flocks and men servants and women servants. And I have sent to tell my Lord that I might find grace in his sight. all through this passage, I don't think that Jacob is apologizing for having the blessing, because that was God's doing ultimately, and there's no way to revoke that. But I think in everything that he does to be submissive, I think there is an apology underlying, not for having the blessing, but for the trickery and deceit that he used. I think there's a conciliatory spirit on the part of Jacob in that regard, because he got what was right, but he didn't get it the right way. And I think he knows that. And that's one reason why I think he is afraid. I think it's one reason why he is humbled in all of this. He's seeking grace. That's what he needs the grace for in verse 5. And he's also telling Esau in all of this, isn't he, that I'm not coming to take. I got plenty. I don't want anything you have. I just want you to be at peace with me and to be gracious to me. But, verse 6, the messengers come back and you find Esau? Oh yeah, we found him. He's coming. He's coming with 400 men. Doesn't sound like the welcome wagon, does it? He doesn't say what they had on their mind, but, it seems likely. I tell you what Jacob thought was on his mind. You can tell that by what he does next. What he does now is divides his people into flocks and herds, camels, 2 bands. And he said, well, if he attacks one, at least part of the group will escape. Tell you what else he does. Verse 9, he prays. And this is the prayer recorded in verse 9. O God of my father Abraham, Isaac, Lord, which said to me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. When did he tell him all that? Wasn't that at Bethel? I'm not worthy, verse 10, of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over Jordan, and now I am 2 bands. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children. And thou sayest, I will surely do thee good, and will make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. I don't think I really appreciated this until this last going through Genesis. But God says to Jacob, I remember your vow from 20 years ago. And now Jacob says to God, I remember your vow from 20 years ago. Remember me. Bless me. So, having prayed, he lodged there that night. And he makes the decision to send ahead of his 2 camps presents. It'd be nearly 600 animals here. You count them all up. 200 she-goats and he-goats and ewes and rams and camels and their coats and kine and bulls and the she-asses and the foals, all of these. And he delivered them to the servants. And he said, he put them in 3 groups. And he said, I want you to go toward and intercept Esau. And when Esau asks you what these mean, who are these, where are they from, you tell him, these are your servant Jacob's, sent as a present to his lord Esau. And behold, he's coming. And so he did. He encountered these waves, one wave, and then the second wave, and then the third wave. Why did he do all this? Why did Jacob do this? Verse 20. He said, moreover, behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with a present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Peradventure, he will accept of me. And so he lodged all night with his company. For some reason, he got up in the middle of the night and decided that something else needed to be done. He took his 2 wives and his 2 concubines and his 11 sons, and he took them over the Jabbok. But he went back by himself on the other side of the river. And then something extraordinary happened, something that has been talked about a great deal, and it's rather a mystery. We don't have as much information as we'd like. But this is where Jacob wrestled with the angel. In verse 24, Jacob was left alone. And there wrestled, the old translation says, a man with him until the breaking of day. And when he, I assume the man, saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, the socket of his hip, we might say. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. If you just were wrestling with a fellow who you thought was maybe trying to rob you or something of that line, you would not say that to him, would you? You wouldn't say to a mugger, I'm not going to let you go till you bless me. It's obvious that though he is described here as a man, anybody have anything different in verse 24? Everybody says man, don't they? He looked like a man. At first, maybe he thought he was a man. But as they struggled, it became evident to Jacob that this was not an ordinary man. And he was not, by the way. We know that several reasons, one of which is in the book of Hosea. In Hosea chapter 12, I believe it is. In verse 4. Hosea makes reference to this and talks about how that he wrestled with an angel. Well, Jacob had certainly seen angels, hadn't he? But this angel comes in a different form, it seems. There'd be no reason to describe him as a man if he did not appear so. But it's evident to Jacob that he knows this is not just a man. This is the emissary of God. And he wants a blessing from him. I still think that on one level, despite what God has said, that Jacob is not sure that he's not going to die the next day. Because he knows Esau, 20 years ago, was very serious about taking his head off. And he's concerned not just about himself, but about his family. He doesn't want to see them slaughtered or brought into slavery. And so I think God sends this man in order to draw something good out of Jacob. However this grappling went, it becomes pretty soon evident that this heavenly messenger wanted to leave, but Jacob said, I'm not letting you go until you give me the blessing of God. Now, that's never happened to me. Has it ever happened to you? Anybody ever wrestled with an angel? That's what you know of. But I'll tell you, there have been a lot of times when we've been torn up about something, emotionally, concerned, racked, and we're people of faith, but we're also human beings who feel fear, and we're struggling to try to get all of that under control, and we've wrestled, in some sense. And what God does here is he gives Jacob yet another assurance. I think Mahanaim was an assurance. That's what those two hosts, that angelic host was for. And I think in this case, this whole thing is about an assurance. Out of this encounter, this strange encounter, Jacob receives a new name, doesn't he? He's not only Jacob now, but he's what? Israel, that's right. And so he is one who has striven with God and prevailed. As a prince, thou hast power with God and with men and hast prevailed. It seems like the angel is saying, God got you through that very dangerous situation with Laban, and God will get you through this as well. And so he calls the name of that place Penuel, which means the face of God, because I've seen God face to face. Not literally, but he's seen the messenger of God face to face. And by the way, this little detail is given to us. Moses writing many years later says, and by the way, to this day, the Jews don't eat the muscle down there by the hip out of memory of this story. That's a little strange detail given to us. But this was a story that was told again and again and again and again. I imagine even before Moses wrote these words, this is a story that was passed down and was held in high regard as important. Our father, Israel, got that name, having striven with the angel for a blessing and prevailed. Question you have about 32. We haven't exhausted it. Yes, sir.
What do you think prompted them to fast? Jacob realized who it was, and he was going to get that blessing, and that's what started it.
That's the most likely, though he doesn't say. But, again, all we're given is what we have. But that's the most likely to me. I don't think they were at odds with each other in the sense that they were, trying to whip each other. But the idea is, let me go. Let me go. Right, right. Yes, sir.
You made a point about how God was working with Jacob. And, that prayer reminds me of the prayer that Moses, when God was going to destroy the people. And Moses made all these things, made statements to God about your promises.
Mm-hmm.
Not a thing that God didn't already know.
Right.
God had not forgotten those promises.
Right.
But it's a development of Jacob. It was the development of Moses, and it's the same thing with us today, I think. The prayer that when we pray to God is for our benefit, not that we're bringing God down to us, but that we're drawing up to God.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. Well, I would really like to get 33, but this is the climax of the story we've been telling this morning, the great threat of Esau, and now the time has come. When Jacob lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, Esau and the 400 men. And now he divides his family into 4 groups. He divides them into Rachel and Leah's family and into the family of the handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah. And he puts the handmaids first, which, is interesting. And who's last in this list? Here's the potential enemy, and whom I put in the back? Of course, Rachel, of course. And Joseph, who's her only son at this time. But I love verse 3. He passed over before them. Jacob puts himself in the front of that line, before all of his family. That's a good mark. And he bows himself 7 times until he came near to his brother Esau. We'll pick up the story there and see Esau's reaction Wednesday night. If you would, please read over again 33, 34, 35, and maybe 36, which is the genealogy. We're going to try to cover that material as our time is running low, and we'll pick up the story there next time. Thank you so much for your